new edition, if you will, of our Berlin Center discussions on development cooperation. These are truly testing times for international development policies, with multiple crises after COVID, the war of aggression of Russia and Ukraine, with all the consequences on cost of living and food prices in particular, and also shifting geoeconomic constellations. It's really important to think about how to design international development cooperation, in particular also to contribute to solving the climate policy challenge. And so I'm very happy to present my colleague Rahul Malhotra today, who will introduce us into the subject based on a recent report of the OECD, which really details the challenges and then develops ideas for action. And we will focus today on climate finance, because that's a particular challenge. And so after Rahul's presentation, I have a very diverse and distinguished panel with whom we can discuss those issues. So there will be Laia Achampong. She's a senior policy and advocacy officer at the European Network on Debt and Development, and she has a specialization in climate finance. Juan Casado Asenio is also from the OECD Development Cooperation Directorate, and he will sit in for the OECD into these discussions. And then Uli Volz is a senior research fellow at the German Institute of Development and Sustainability, and he's also a professor of economics and the director of the Center for Sustainable Finance at SOAS, the University of London. But without further ado, Rahul, I give you the floor and the screen, and we are looking forward to your introductions into this important subject.
Thank you very much, Nicola, and good morning to everyone. Let me start by thanking you, Nicola, and your team for hosting this event at the OECD Berlin Center, and I'm delighted to be able to share the main messages from the 2023 Development Cooperation Report, which is entitled Debating the Aid System. And I really do hope that today's discussion will inspire everyone with ideas for finding solutions and common ground across the development ecosystem. So I'm going to run through these slides really quickly so as not to monopolize the time, but the report did cover a lot of very rich ground with a lot of extremely esteemed experts and authors, which I will not do justice to, but let me go through very quickly just what the report touches upon. Next slide, please. So, why focus on the aid system and debate it, and why now? I think it's no surprise to anyone that the context when we started thinking about this report was very much that of overlapping crises and the erosion of development progress, which was really putting aid budgets and international development cooperation under immense strain and demand. And it was clear that while demand for ODA was growing, the actual supply was not. And also the way in which the pie is sliced of ODA was changing, with a smaller share of ODA going directly to partner countries at a time of debt crisis and shrinking fiscal space, not least amidst COVID and now the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine. So providing the right support at the right time and in the right places, I think it's fair to say, has become extremely challenging to development cooperation providers, and hard budget choices and trade-offs are having to be made. Next slide, please. So we decided in consultation with our member states that the 2023 flagship report, which is actually the 60th edition, would really take stock of the debates about the aid system and invite diverse perspectives with a focus on the global south in particular. So we challenged ourselves to do three things. Firstly, to get out of our Eurocentric echo chamber and to, like I say, invite several contributors, mostly from the global south. We also wanted to get beyond problem statements and diagnostics and really focus on solutions and actions that could be taken by the international community to course correct and to respond to challenges. And then finally, we wanted to do our homework here at the OECD by reviewing our evidence and our data on aid policy, practice, and performance. And once again, let me acknowledge the really excellent contributions from all of the authors to the report. Next slide, please. The report also set out to explore and answer deeper questions that touch on the motivations and challenge the identity of ODA today. So it's clear that development actors are trying to adapt to a context of rivaling development models. We're grappling with a range of dilemmas and challenges around what some label as the instrumentalization of development cooperation as states compete for global influence and power. And at the same time, the need to uphold long-standing and recognized values and commitments and to meet those commitments, including on human rights. So the report really provides ideas to navigate these growing number of tensions and trade-offs that the aid system is grappling with. Next slide, please. And this is what it looks like. So this is the table of contents, and I would just invite all of you to click on the link when you get it and to explore, dip in and dip out. Like I said, there's a number of very inspiring, also from very senior leaders, some inspiring views and perspectives. Next slide, please. So this is what it boils down to. What we wanted to do, like I said, is translate the spirit of global solidarity, partnership, and burden sharing into action. And that's become the greatest challenge for development cooperation today. Keeping promises and upholding principles are at the center of recurring debates and critiques of international cooperation, like I said, and delivering on this is even more urgent and challenging in the face of multiple crises and complexity. And today's session is timely in that we know all leaders are gathering in New York to address these very questions this week in New York at UNGA. So the report presents 4 ways forward for the aid system and several ideas for action to enhance relevance and impact. I'm going to touch on each of the 4 very briefly, and then I'll conclude with the theme of the day, which is around climate finance. Next slide, please. So the first way forward that I'd focus on is to support locally led transformation. And this really is, it's a common theme in the report in terms of a renewed attention to for the need to back national and locally led economic transformation and adhere to country ownership. In addition, there's a growing momentum to increase the localization of aid, and this is driven by a more vocal and empowered Southern civil society, but also the increased reliance on local partners for program delivery during the COVID-19 crisis really shone a light on what was possible. And then finally, there is also a focus on redressing North-South power imbalances in how development cooperation is established and discharged. Next slide, please. So we know that tailoring to context is critical for success, and yet alignment and ownership are among the top really tricky challenges that we face today that are affecting the relevance and impact of development cooperation. So developing countries consistently signal that they prefer to receive expertise from a variety of actors, and development cooperation is under greater pressure to find its niche, its added value at a time of wider choice of partners, different development pathways, and geopolitical competition, as well as supply side objectives from providers. So a clear message from the contributors to this report is that international partners should support or will support transformation when they listen to and meet country and regional advice on where and how they can add value. And we know that partners have a clear view of this and stress that particularly for the OECD DAC type membership, there is a real interest and need for support around job creation, governance, anti-corruption, and the rule of law. And this is according to leaders from the Global South. There's also continued support for or high demand for budget and capacity building support. Next slide, please. So making good on the ambition to localize aid and empower communities is very easy in rhetoric. It's very hard in reality. It's fraught with constraints that are political, cultural, and technical. Many of the constraints from a sort of more parochial sense are boiled down to perception and assessment of risk, which then translates into very complex compliance systems in the development cooperation world. And these systems block access to finance for local organizations. Progress is far too slow. So for example, we see direct support for local civil society organizations from OECD DAC members is just 1% of total bilateral ODA, albeit a few years ago from 2019 to 2020. Next slide, please. So the second pillar or bucket of issues is around modernizing business processes and models for international development. And we must continue to be informed by evidence and maintain a sharp focus on development impact. When business models focus on impact and when providers coordinate to maximize the collective impact of ODA, transaction costs for partners decrease, and we see economies of scale enhanced, and we see budgets addressing needs far better. And we also see an impact focus, a laser focus on impact really helps get the right balance between short-term and longer-term development objectives. Next slide, please. However, the reality is that aid portfolios, whether they be bilateral or multilateral, are tending to get increasingly fragmented. So there is, for example, a proliferation of low-value projects in development cooperation, despite the demand and emphasis on investing in scale and in transformation. And the evidence can be seen as being quite worrying. So in 2021, for example, the average number of partner countries for DAC members was 97, at a time when ODA as a share of national income has been relatively stable, and a declining share of bilateral ODA is earmarked for partner countries. Next slide, please. We also see that domestic policy environments in OECD countries really can shape aid delivery in addition. So policymakers are navigating very complex and competing national interests related to development cooperation and pressures to serve different purposes such as trade, stemming migration, or national security. Now, this is not new, and this is why the OECD has recognized that policy coherence for sustainable development is critical, and a recommendation exists around enhancing policy coherence for sustainable development, although implementation remains challenging. Next slide, please. The third area, and perhaps the most contentious in the report, was around rebalancing power relations. So we addressed the issue and need for broader system-wide reform of the international system, and this in the wake of what can be described as a breakdown in trust, but also Global South leaders really making loud clarion calls for climate justice, for a fairer international financing system, and systemic reforms to include and enhance the voice and recognize the agency of developing nations in global decision making. So this report brings to light several systemic barriers and legacies which need to be tackled at all levels of international relations, including the aid system. And here you see in the next slide, you see some quotes from the report that really speak to the sort of broader global calls to focus on racial justice and paternalism, and to address how they're playing out in the aid system. And we see several OECD members now really encouragingly are developing strategies to address some of those systemic issues and top-down decision-making and power imbalances. So this greater openness to address these challenges is a positive step forward, and the report outlines a range of concrete actions to make progress on this front, starting with real honest institutional reflection and awareness raising on some of these very sensitive questions. And then the fourth bucket is around meeting financing commitments. And collectively, the international community, as we know, is lagging behind on finance commitments. Up to 2022, ODA as a share of donors' national income had leveled off at 0.33% for several years, despite that commitment to 0.70%. And despite budgetary increases for the pandemic response domestically. ODA increased significantly in 2022 in line with the international response to Russia's war of aggression in Ukraine. And that increase was seen mostly in humanitarian aid and also in what we call in-donor refugee costs, which is spent domestically in provider countries. But I think it does go to show, both COVID and Ukraine goes to show that where the will exists, countries are able to scale up. However, overall aid is not flowing sufficiently, as we've mentioned, to where needs are the greatest, whether it's in developing countries, whether it's in the least developed countries, or targeting inequality or multidimensional poverty. And in the past few years, we've also seen the conditions for ODA lending to least developed countries have hardened, despite agreement to make access easier. So what can we do about these gaps? One very concrete proposal that we make in the report is to use time-bound action plans more deliberately as a tool to implement commitments. And we've seen through the DAC peer reviews, for example, that this good practice really works, but it's not yet mainstreamed enough. So solid plans foster greater realism. They build awareness amongst key stakeholders beyond the aid ecosystem domestically, such as ministries of finance and civil society and parliaments, of what it really means to turn commitment into practice and the bottlenecks that are needed to be overcome. So, for example, when plans examine the level of budgetary effort of ODA needed, you'll see this figure in the slide shows that ODA as a percentage of government spending is minuscule. It's very, very small. So again, this kind of evidence and forward planning will provide a margin to mobilize more ODA and align its allocation with development commitments. Next slide, please. And let me conclude now on the issue of climate finance, which our esteemed panelists will be discussing and debating themselves. And I have to say that climate finance emerged as a really strong theme throughout the report, which also, as with the more traditional challenges, creates additional challenges for the aid system, but also opportunities. So the consequences of widening financing gaps are increasingly stark in the face of the drastic impacts of climate change. We see it every day in the news. It is alarming. Now, the agreement for creating a loss and damage fund in 2022 was a positive sign, but the growing incidence of climate catastrophes are bringing home just how much more finance is needed. And it goes beyond development finance, it goes beyond ODA. And yet the 2009 commitment to mobilize $100 billion annually by 2020 has not been met. It was $83.3 billion in 2020, according to OECD analysis. And at present, it's impossible to calculate, and I'm just wrapping up, Nicola, I'll be 2 minutes. At present, it's impossible to calculate how much ODA contributed to this commitment, although the share of ODA for climate adaptation and mitigation has been growing year on year, even if the overall pie has not. So we see now there's a real opportunity to seize the moment in preparing for the post-2025 global climate finance goal. A major achievement will be in improving access and credibility on climate finance, will be in agreeing how to measure and track climate finance in a way that gives clarity to the role of concessional flows like ODA, and more transparency is essential for progress. And I think Leah, who was the author of chapter 3 in our report, will speak to this challenge as well. And another challenge that we must address, like just as we pointed to earlier, is the fragmentation and the lack of coordination of climate finance within country. And my colleague Juan will share our latest evidence on these issues from OECD research in small island developing states in particular. Next slide, please. So to conclude, that is it. I hope that you will find this 60th edition of the Development Cooperation Report a timely stocktake of the opportunities and challenges we face daily to provide relevant, impactful, and effective development cooperation. And let me end by just saying that it's very easy to see the glass half empty, but I think we can use this report to see the glass as half full, but partly because we are listening. We are waking up to the calls, and we are really listening to our counterparts in the global south, and we need to continue to do that if we're going to really meet that purpose of solidarity and leveling up. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Raoul, for this excellent introduction. And before I let you withdraw in some sense, I wanted to ask you, so a very powerful plea for coherence, for putting countries' needs first by listening to them, but also increasing financing. You did mention several times the OECD DAC committee and the peer reviews. And perhaps very briefly, you could tell the audience what this is, because not everybody might be familiar with that, and then we'll dive into the discussion.
Of course, yes, you're absolutely right. I should have explained that. So the OECD Development Assistance Committee consists of 32 members today, and it really is the place, the body where the rules are set for official development assistance and where they are also monitored. And so part of the condition of becoming a member of the OECD DAC is to be peer reviewed, for example, every 5 to 6 years, as well as all the data, the provision of data into the OECD systems that we then use to produce reports and analysis like this. I hope that will suffice.
That's perfect. Thank you very much. And yes, and I think we have a lot of important issues to discuss. We did underline how important climate finance is, but we also said that overall, development cooperation needs to be more coherent, more focused on the real needs, and also needs to put partner countries in a way in a driving seat. And Uli, I would perhaps like to start with you, and perhaps from your perspective as a researcher, also climate finance, sustainable finance expert, could you tell us what you think are the main barriers in the current context for achieving the goals, also achieving climate goals? What needs to be done to put partner countries in a position to really, enhance their development of their countries, but also tackle the climate challenge?
Well, first of all, thanks a lot for having me. Great pleasure to be here, and congratulations on this new report. Well, there are obviously a lot of challenges and hurdles, and there are no silver bullets, but let me highlight one major challenge. And again, it's not the only one, and that is the debt crisis that is really has been building up now for many years. And so when we talk about fostering development, I mean, we have to recognize that over the last couple of years, we've actually seen positive development trends reverse partly. So we are absolutely not on track in achieving the SDGs. And the situation where 50, 60 countries in the global south are struggling very severely with external debt is really worsening the situation, because if there is no fiscal room, they have little chance to invest in the SDGs. There's also no scope to invest in climate resilience, which is absolutely critical, because if they don't invest in resilience, development will be threatened very much. So we need very, very urgently to tackle the debt crisis, and the attempts of the international community over the last couple of years, unfortunately, have not been sufficient at all. So I would like to put this on the table, and I would like to address a second problem when it comes to financing development, and that is that the international discourse on mobilizing capital and private capital, I think, has been somewhat disconnected from reality. So we've been talking about mobilizing the trillions and shifting trillions from advanced countries to developing countries, but the reality is that we actually have a lot of capital flowing the other direction. So the mobilization of private capital, international private capital, has not been successful. We have to be very clear about that. So there's a lot of interesting stuff happening, trying to get international private capital flowing, but this has not been successful at large. And at the same time, we have a lot of capital flowing out. So we need to rethink both. What can work in mobilizing international private capital? And very importantly, how can we mobilize domestic financial resources in a much better way so that a lot of savings in the global south are not being exported to the financial centers of the rich countries, from where they're partly flowing back then, but at much higher cost. So just throwing a couple of problems here. We can also discuss solutions to that later. Thank you.
Yeah, excellent. Just two little follow-up questions. So one is the debt crisis. Of course, in some ways it has always been there, but it has probably been worsened by the recent crises, such as COVID, such as the war in Ukraine. So does this mean basically that developed countries have to match the scope of the crisis in some ways, also in their efforts to help countries tackle the debt crisis? And then when you say, well, the private capital is not flowing in the right direction, I would think that this is also related to the debt crisis and other, let's say, general economic framework conditions, because it's very difficult for private capital to be productive in a country that's struggling with the debt crisis. So in some ways, this is probably linked, right? So not only thinking about how much ODA goes to countries, or official development assistance goes to countries, but also helping these countries to set up the right framework conditions so that private money can follow in some ways rather than flowing out.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I mean, obviously the debt crisis is making the mobilization of private capital, both domestic and international, very difficult, if not impossible. You know, if you have a sovereign that is struggling severely, that is also cutting investment, where you have basically a really negative economic outlook, you won't see much private investment, both domestic and international. And of course, also the debt crisis has led to and very much also the rise of interest rates in the major advanced economies has of course also led to a redirection of capital away from developing countries to the major advanced countries. And so tackling the debt crisis again is not the only solution, but if we don't tackle that, all other discussions about development and climate finance are going to be very problematic. But also just to say that the capital outflows, this has been a long-standing problem. So there has been the lack of safe investable assets in most countries of the global south. And we're actually just next month we're coming out with a new study where we show that there has been a massive buildup of financial assets owned by developing countries outside. So over the last decade, approximately 10 trillion, so 1 trillion per year. That's a lot of money. That really should be better invested in the countries where the development prospects, the potential returns on investment are much higher, and the development needs are of course much greater.
Leia, you're actually, I think you authored the climate finance chapter. You're an expert on climate finance, but you're also on debt, and we're in the middle of that discussion, right? So Raoul pointed out that we need a better multi-year plan, how to increase official development assistance, but Uli made the point that the debt crisis also needs to be tackled. You focused on specifically climate finance, but in your view, what are the main levers that need to be activated, used in order to really improve climate finance, going to the global south and helping countries tackle the challenge?
Thank you. And hello, everyone. It's really good to have been invited here today, and I'm looking forward to the discussions. Coming back to Uli's points, I certainly agree that there need to be more debt considerations that are integrated into climate finance decision-making processes, particularly with regards to the types of financing instruments that are used to disperse finance. Take, for example, Pakistan. Their historic floods are an example of loss and damage. But due to the current 100 billion goal not covering loss and damage, they held a pledging conference at the start of 2023, and approximately 90% of the finance pledged was in the form of loans over a 3-year period. These types of loans are contributing to countries' indebtedness, and whilst it's welcome that initiatives such as the Macron-Motley Summit, Paris Summit in June of this year, that an agreement was made on climate debt pauses. These only apply to future loan agreements. So these loans can't be the answer. Instead, there does need to be more grants. There needs to be unconditional debt cancellation for countries in need. And this must go across all creditors, bilateral, multilateral, and private and intermediary. And a longer term goal should be to establish a multilateral debt workout mechanism under the United Nations. But debt also has a crippling impact on public services, such as social protection programs, food or energy subsidies, access to maternity and childcare. And these cuts fall heavily on women, girls, and gender minorities, particularly those who are experiencing it at the intersection inequalities, so based on class, race, ethnicity, age, caste, etc. And it's women's unpaid care and domestic work that's being used as a shock absorber for these public services cuts. So the impact on women and girls and gender minorities is clear, and this is why in the chapter I wrote, I highlighted the need for there to be more gender responsive climate finance that looks at the needs of entire communities and doesn't undermine vital access to public services. This includes dispersing climate finance to female-led organizations, particularly those in local communities, but this also includes ensuring that there is a strong and coherent transparency and reporting framework to ensure that countries are actually reporting on the finance that they're providing. And we need this data, this disaggregated data on gender responsive climate finance to understand what the impact it's having within communities, so that we can take stock and also implement course correction to ensure that finance truly is having an impact on the ground as well.
Thank you, Leia. Perhaps so. I think you made it very clear that, you know, debt crises, not enough official development assistance are affecting women particularly, and then perhaps they cannot contribute to economic activity, attacking the climate challenge or making their contribution, because they have to pick up the slack in some ways for social services. But perhaps you can elaborate on that a little bit. So how are women, the girls, affected by insufficient climate finance or by the climate policy, climate impacts, climate change impacts, sorry. And then also, why is it so important that they can be a part of the solution? Why is it so important to empower them? Also specifically with respect to the climate change issue.
Yeah. Thank you. So when you look at the impacts of climate change on ecosystems and food production services, this tends to have a particular impact on impoverished communities and on women and girls, particularly if they are heavily dependent on those resources for livelihoods. And in the wake, if there is if a country is struggling with unsustainable debt levels, then the government may find it difficult to reconstruct damaged routes to ensure that women and girls can have access to the different ecosystems that they are depending on. And if infrastructure is damaged by extreme events, this can additionally impact their ability to access these resources, such as access to clean drinking water during and after an extreme climatic event. Additionally, there's an impact in terms of if their homes have been destroyed, then women tend to be at higher risk of living in unsafe and overcrowded shelters, given particularly their lack of owned land or of property, which then makes them more vulnerable to all forms of gender-based violence, including human trafficking and child marriage as well. So there is a real need to, with regards to climate finance, there is a real need to be conducting intersectional gender analyses, which will help to determine the differing needs and interests and accessibility to finance mechanisms, as well as the power dynamics that exist within a community. Women, Indigenous women, racialized women, they may not have the same access to finance mechanisms, and as traditionally marginalized groups, they are impacted by the power dynamics within that community. And so there is a need to conduct such intersectional gender analyses with regards to climate finance to help increase, to help ensure that there's a more equitable distribution of finance within communities, and to strengthen the understanding of the social and intersectional additionality of climate finance. Some countries do have in place measures on gender responsive climate finance. In the report, I highlighted the case of Canada, where the Canadian government has a commitment for 80% of all climate finance programming to integrate gender, and has developed a framework for project implementers to track gender equality as well. This is all useful, but not all countries are putting in place such measures. And what's interesting is that if you look at the OECD's climate-related ODA report, it shows that countries are submitting data, enough data for the OECD to aggregate in order to determine what the gender responsiveness is of climate-related ODA. However, countries are not putting in place those same measures with regards to UNFCCC climate finance flows. It's not clear why they're not doing this, but clearly there is a framework that they can be making use of. We just need to be pushing them to actually do that. And now under the UNFCCC, it has been decided that for projections of climate finance, the gender responsiveness should be tracked, but it remains to be seen how effectively countries will be meeting that goal.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Leah. And I think we will delve further into both issues, the debt and also the gender responsiveness. But for the moment, I would like to pick up on another point, Juan, that Raul made, which is more work needs to be done to ensure that the money actually goes where it's most needed. And you're making that more concrete in some ways in the climate finance arena with your current work on small island developing states, where you look into capacity building, how to absorb climate finance. And perhaps you can give us a glimpse of your work. So is it the case that these countries who are in particular need, obviously, to have climate finance, that they cannot access the existing sources in the way they should? And if so, what can be done about it? What are your first results?
Yes, of course. Thank you so much for the invitation also from my side, Paula and colleagues from the Berlin Center. It's very exciting to share some of this research, some of the findings through this channel. Yes, we have been doing some work on trying to understand how donors can be more effective at supporting small and developing states so that they can achieve more or better results in their capacity development activities, so that seeds in turn can be, can act more and can be more ambitious on their climate related, projects and plans, and so they can react more to what they need. What we see, well, I mean, clearly seeds, small and developing states, is a very diverse group of countries. Some are very different from one to the other, but they tend to be small, they tend to be in remote areas, they are experiencing very intense climate impacts, and also, of course, they're very much subject to the issue of debt that has been mentioned here. We see that the DAC, as a community of bilateral donors, has committed now for several years to support these type of countries for more intensely. They mentioned small and developing states in their high-level communique, the last one in 2020. They mentioned small and developing states in the DAC declaration, new approach to align development cooperation with the Paris Agreement on climate change. So there is more and more attention being placed on this group of countries. When we look at the trends also in official development assistance from the DAC and from the multilaterals, we do see an increase of attention. But when we actually just look at the DAC themselves, it's more of a flat story. It doesn't really increase so much. So I think there's one first element, is that those commitments on development finance need to be met, and there needs to be more climate related development finance for small and developing states, and in general the 100 billion goal needs to be met as a starting point for any conversation that we want to have on climate finance. It's going to increase the trust among the parties, and it's going to leave some more room to discuss other things, and maybe discuss solutions and ways forward beyond just a particular and important number. However, on the seeds, when we look at the climate-related development finance, although overall development finance is flat, we see that for seeds, the climate-related development finance is going up. So there's more and more attention being placed there overall. But again, if we look deeper at these numbers, what we do see is that although most of this is for climate change adaptation, and a significant share is also going in the form of grants, it is a very volatile story from one year to the other. It is concentrated only in a few countries, in a few small and developing states, in a few regions. It's coming from a small pool of bilateral donors, and climate vulnerability discussions, and whichever index you want to take to measure this, is not really driving the allocation of this development finance. So that's the story from a quantitative point of view, and I can also talk about the qualitative and the results, and what motivated us to look at the topic of capacity development in more in depth, if you want.
Yes, that would be great, but let's take another round, and I'll come back to you, and we'll talk on the qualitative. So what, I suppose, what actually needs to be done, because I'm going to ask the other panelists also about this. So Uli, coming back to the debt problem, and also the problem of money flowing in the wrong direction. So obviously, we already established that the debt crisis needs to be tackled. Otherwise, it's very difficult for money to flow in the right, for private money to flow in the right direction. Regarding that point, I would like you to detail a little bit. So Leah already talked about the fact that all, not the debtor, how you show that. So all the countries who gave basically creditors, sorry. All the creditors would need to work together to tackle this issue, and this is also because of, well, changing geoeconomic landscape that has, I think, become more difficult. So what would be the right framework for that in your mind? Or is it also, do you agree with Leah that this is important? And then And then a second question I would have is, so the debt issue is clear, but are there other issues, economic policy issues, capacity issues, like the one is working on, that donor countries need to work with the global south, so they can create the conditions for attracting the money they need in order to tackle their challenges and our global climate challenge?
Yeah, well, two questions that are difficult to answer in a few sentences. Let me just start with the last one, the capacity building aspect. I mean, capacity building, or kind of having the right capacity, is obviously crucial for everything. And for example, when it comes to debt management and public finances, there are huge challenges also related, of course, to the climate crisis. If I may actually throw in a little bit of self-advertisement here, we've been developing over the last couple of years at SOAS with the colleagues from the World Resources Institute, an initiative called RAMP, which is about building capacities at finance ministries, at other central ministries, relating to well, climate proofing public finances, better debt management, better public financial management, and so on, where we're actually working through universities in the countries to build the local capacities to train officials and so on. But I mean, we need much more capacities across the board, and so to connect it back to the first question on how to tackle the debt crisis, it's clear we need to involve all creditors. Yeah? Obviously, the creditor structure differs from country to country, but kind of across the board, overall, we have around 60% of the outstanding debt of over-indebted countries to private creditors. So getting private creditors to the table is vital. The common framework that the G20 set up does provide no incentives, or also kind of pressure, puts no pressure on private creditors to partake in debt restructuring. So that's a big problem. But we also, and that is a very contentious issue, we also need to make sure that actually all public creditors participate in a fair manner. And that does not only involve China, and there has been a lot of discussion about the role of China, but that also has to address the multilateral institutions. The reality is that we actually have a large number of countries, especially low-income countries, where the debt exposure to multilateral development banks is enormous. Yeah? So there are many countries, I think almost 20 countries, where that have more than half of their external debt to multilateral institutions. And there's no way of addressing, kind of providing sufficient debt relief without involving the MDBs. And that's, of course, a very difficult issue, and it has a direct impact on development finance and ODA, because at the end of the day, if multilateral institutions provide debt relief, that these losses have to be covered, and they have to be covered by the shareholders. But there's no way around it, and we need kind of fair ways of including them, of course, accounting for the much greater concessionary elements that MDBs have been providing. So they need to take relatively smaller losses than private creditors who had a much higher interest rate in their lending. So again, there are no easy solutions, but we need a really concerted effort. And with colleagues, we've been working since 2020 in proposing a kind of HIPIC type approach, where the countries that need it, and we look at 50, 60 countries, will provide comprehensive debt relief, but they have to commit themselves then to ambitious reforms, driving the SDGs and also climate action, which for most countries of these countries will specifically be adaptation action. So we need well, some real major initiative, because this case-by-case approach currently is very, very slow, and it very much discourages countries that need debt relief from seeking it. And that history has shown will basically lead to lost decades, and we really can't afford the lost decades, because this was supposed to be the decade of action.
Yeah, thanks. And thanks, Uli. And our audience is surprisingly silent. Usually we have big discussion in the chat or questions. So I'll invite you again to comment, to contribute your thoughts. But there's one thought I would like to put to you, but then also to the others on their specific issues. Felicitas Hillman, she's basically asking, are there countries in terms of, let's say, debt relief, trying to cooperate better, trying to involve multilateral development banks, but then also to the financial fiscal capacity building, perhaps in the global south itself? Are there some countries you can point to that are really pushing the agenda in the right directions, that are perhaps examples to follow, a little bit like Canada for the gender sensitive development financing, because we want to learn from each other. So perhaps you have some examples to mention?
Well, I can mention maybe better than just picking out one single country. I would like to mention the V20 group of finance ministers, which is representing, I think now, 56 climate vulnerable countries. The numbers are growing, so I'm not sure if that's the correct latest. But so they have been putting forward plans for tackling the debt crisis, and these countries are very much aware of their climate vulnerability. They do recognize that to thrive, to achieve their development ambitions, they need to invest in climate resilience. They also want to invest in climate mitigation, because that also is a matter of economic competitiveness, developing their exports and so on. And so they've been putting forward a comprehensive, ambitious proposal for debt relief, where, similar to what I said before, countries that receive debt relief do commit to ambitious policy agendas, also where part of the relief received is earmarked for spending, and they have developed their own what they call climate prosperity plans. So they have all the kind of the plans in their drawers already. We don't need the IMF to tell them how to we don't need IMF climate conditionality or that stuff. So we need something in that direction, I believe, and we need it sooner than later. And I think we've had this string of summits over the last couple of months, and the demand, including the Nairobi Declaration from the African leaders, from the African Climate Summit, was very clear. There needs to be ambitious debt relief sooner than later, because otherwise we'll lose a lot of countries, and a lot of countries have zero chance to achieve the SDGs, including, of course, climate.
Yeah, Laia, that's actually an important point, because Laia, you said before we need debt relief and it needs to be unconditional. Then Uli said, yeah, but the countries should then commit to really making sure that the additional financing in some ways, or the reduced burden, is contributing to climate resilience. They should have strong policy agendas in place to really achieve the SDGs. So perhaps you can elaborate on that a little bit. So debt relief, sort of unconditional, but yeah, well, don't countries need a plan then what to do when they have more policy space, more fiscal space to actually receive their goals?
Yeah, I think that with regards to having plans, countries do have their nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement. And additionally, you have a number of countries that also have long-term climate and energy strategies. And you also have some countries who are developing green budgets, whereby they specifically are including climate, environmental conservation and biodiversity concerns into these green budget frameworks as well. I think that the sort of narrative that countries who receive debt relief will not necessarily spend it on countries who receive debt relief as a direct response of needing climate finance will not spend it on climate finance. I don't think that narrative is especially true, particularly when you take into account the disproportionate impacts of climate change that these countries are facing. A lot of them do already have specific plans and strategies in place for climate mitigation, for climate adaptation, and to address loss and damage. The issue is that they do not have the fiscal space and sometimes the financial sovereignty in order to implement those plans. So I do think that it's that the narrative does need to be shifted and changed to highlight the work that these countries are already doing. Take, for instance, the Nairobi Declaration that came out of the Africa Climate Summit last week or 2 weeks ago. And in there's very clear points in there around the need for debt management frameworks, overall debt management frameworks, not just debt management frameworks for climate change. There's also points in there around the need for default frameworks to create this fiscal space that countries need to finance both development and climate action. There's also points in there around debt restructuring, debt relief, and debt cancellation as well. And there's this idea of a new global climate finance charter under the UN General Assembly and the COP processes. They are proposing this new financing structure by 2025, I believe it is. I think that there are a lot of structures that countries are actually putting in place domestically, but they're also looking to work together. So it's the V20, it's the Africa Group of Negotiators, it's AOSIS, it's a range of different countries. It's just about ensuring that these countries have the democratic ownership over these climate finance strategies, as well as the democratic ownership over these debt restructuring frameworks. So when I talk about the need for unconditional debt cancellation, it is specifically in relation to countries that are very much in need of it, whether it be a country that has just gone through an extreme loss and damage event, such as Pakistan, or whether it be a country that is seeking to transition out of fossil fuels generation and production and moving towards renewable energies, and thus needs the debt cancellation because they may fall foul of an investor-state dispute settlement process. The Boston University put out a great report that highlighted that ISDSs are going to be a huge financial burden on countries as specific industries dislike seeing this transition away from fossil fuels. So unconditional debt cancellation, I think the narrative is wrong to say that such countries wouldn't necessarily have anything in place to put that money towards in relation to climate action.
Thanks, Leah. And I do have a question following up on that for Juan, but you raised your hand, and Uli, we want to be interactive, so please make your
I'll keep it short. I just wanted to make clear that I was not I was in fact very explicitly saying that the last thing we need is kind of the IMF to formulate conditionality on climate action or something. So what I was pointing out was that the V20 countries, for example, which do have a very large membership, that they themselves want to determine their course of action. So that's actually very much in line with the theme that you also set out in your new report, locally led transformations. So it's absolutely vital that there is local ownership, but I think it's also clear that, and I do speak also a lot with governments from the global north, which ultimately will have to step in and provide debt relief, not only bilateral debt relief, but also basically fund debt relief through the multilateral institutions. So they are also clear that, you know, if they provide debt relief, then they also want to have kind of see positive development impact. So what I'm saying is that the countries that know, or kind of those who know best about what really needs to happen at the local level are, of course, the people in the country themselves. So they need to, you know, they need to develop the plans, how they want to use debt relief, and because the last thing we need now is debt relief that will kind of be not be used for advancing the SDGs, for advancing climate action, but how to do that really should be the decision of the governments and the people of the country. So no to kind of your grand mass conditionality, but yes to some kind of linking between debt relief and progressive action on in the spirit of the Agenda 2030.
Perfect. Thanks a lot. And I think, Juan, that leads us directly to your work and the qualitative dimension of it. So you did say, well, you know, climate financing for small island developing states is increasing, but it remains very volatile. But then, so that's probably a hindrance also. But the second one is, of course, how do countries develop their plans and how to put them in a position that they can put them into practice, not only with financing, reliable financing, but also by building capacity to doing some local capacity. How can that be done?
Yes, and I mean, I guess there is an issue with how we understand finance. I mean, about 30 to 40% of the climate-related development finance that flows into small and island developing states is actually for projects and activities that are meant to develop the capacities of those countries. And so that is typically, and we have a business as usual, or a current paradigm of how this capacity development is developed through fly-in, fly-out consultants, through a multitude of workshops, through short-term projects, through the integration of capacity concerns into activities, sometimes through well-meaning, of course, checklists so that capacity concerns are integrated into overall programs. But when we see the results, and that's what I meant about the qualitative side of this finance, we do see from the literature, from evaluations, from even the consultations that we did for this work with Sao Tome and Principe, with the Comoros, with St. Lucia, Samoa, Fiji, the Eastern Caribbean States Organization, and Commonwealth, etc. We see that the type of sustainability and the type of efficiency that we would be looking for is just not there. We can look at simply the area of climate change adaptation, where a lot of attention has been placed and should be placed in the future more and more. It's not delivering the results. In fact, we see that the resilience, the latest studies are telling us that some of these small and developing states are less resilient than a few years ago. Of course, this has to do with the pace of climate change. It's faster than how we are intervening in this area. But it also is telling about maladaptation, years of investment where, you know, the result has been maladaptation. It is also a reason why we decided of capacity development in small island developing states, and we conducted this study, and we looked at 5 different areas, and one of them was precisely looking at capacity for access to finance. And the idea was really here to look at what works. So what kind of initiatives are really working that donors could pick up, imitate, replicate, of course, with adaptation to local contexts in other areas. And so that the paradigm that I described, the business as usual story of capacity development, would maybe change, and that 30–40% of financial resources that are invested in capacity development would be used for better results. And I can give you a sense of like some of the issues that are, or some of the ideas that we identified that seem to be working. I mean, of course, from the donor side, as you mentioned, it is key that fragmentation stops. We did find over 15 initiatives just for access to finance, just for small island developing states. I mean, and there's 58 or 59 small island developing states. That's like an initiative almost for 2. So there's a lot of fragmentation in this space. And the German study was very interesting, that actually looked at some of the most important, or the biggest in terms of resources, and looked at how this could become more complementary, where there are overlaps, where there could be synergies moving forward, etc. So that's one starting point. And the other starting point is massive capacity gaps that I think the literature has documented very well in terms of anything that has to do with climate in many of these small island developing states. Was reflected as well in those NDCs that Leah was talking about as well. But what works seems to be trying to surge the capacity of those small island developing states through embedding advisors. Ideally, those advisors are embedded in the ministry. They're not embedded, or they're not supporting the country through parallel implementation units. They're embedded for 3, 4, 5, or even longer years. And they're ideally there to provide end-to-end support. What does this mean? It's basically that they're going to be there to help access the finance. They're going to be there to draft a project proposal, to get the accreditation for their institution, but they're also going to be there until the end of the project, as the money comes and as the implementation starts. Because if you're not able to access the finance, how can you assume that you're going to be able to deploy the finance and implement it successfully and sustainably, etc.? What works as well is that those advisors become sort of legacy partners, so that they stay, and when the donor pulls out, that they continue in the system. And this, of course, requires a much longer engagement on the part of the donor, beyond the project that may be 2–3 years to, we're talking 10–15 years. And there are more and more examples of this happening. I guess a second dimension would be to be comprehensive, so that this person might be coming to support a climate project, but that the climate project goes beyond and starts to also answer other development related issues, so that you do not only provide, for example, supports on renewable energy concern or water and sanitation concern, but you actually look how this is playing out in the broader context. And I think a final point, which was made earlier indirectly about debt issues, is supporting access of international related climate finance from donors and others is one part of the story. But very often donors, if they link their for the support to domestic resource mobilization and fiscal compliance, increasing the fiscal space, etc., if they support the country to access innovative sources of finance, even there's pilots to coordinate the arrival of remittances for climate-related objectives in the Pacific. If those could be somehow harnessed or linked a bit better with development and climate concerns, you would actually find many more avenues to enter and build the capacity of your partner countries.
Excellent. Thanks, Juan, for these insights into the specific work for small island developing countries. And Leah, you raised your hand, and probably have a something important to contribute here, but I would also take the opportunity to ask the question, well, what do you think about this idea of making sure that plans are country-led by embedding advisors rather than having them write notes from afar? I suppose, is that something that would also work in other countries? Is that an idea you like, or what do you think?
Thank you. I definitely agree with the idea that climate finance is as country-driven as possible, whilst also facilitating socioeconomic transformation. I think that it's crucial to ensure that countries in the global south, as well as stakeholders within the country, are also a part of the discussions with regards to policy making, decision making, as well as project implementation as well. And I think this creates the opportunity for countries to design projects and policies and that suit their own specific circumstances and their domestic needs. But it can't just be at a country level. It also needs to ensure that there is inclusion of citizens and residents within a country who have been disproportionately impacted and who have the frontline understanding of what their needs are with regards to mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage. So I would definitely agree with the need for there to be more democratic country ownership, building the capacity for countries to develop projects and strategies on their own without the use of costly international consultants, identifying change agents within communities so that they can be involved in the processes, ensuring that joint partnerships for things like the just energy transition partnerships are fair and do not include policy conditionalities or prioritize the needs of the contributor country, but instead any sort of technologies developed or mined resources or profits from HEP are shared equitably, and that the global south country does have access to that technology as well as supporting opportunities for local manufacturers, producers and sellers. But I actually raised my hand because I wanted to come back on Juan's point on access. I definitely agree that there needs to be greater access. The global climate finance landscape is huge, it's complex and vast, with bilateral, multilateral and other financial flows. And so there needs to be coherent common rules of access to climate finance, because having to navigate all of these different financial flows and accessing them, can be a costly endeavor in itself. So there should be coherent common rules of access. I also think there should be direct access procedures to ensure that marginalized and rural communities have fair access to climate finance that's based on their needs, as well as access to small grant funds so that there is local ownership of projects, and to help replicate local initiatives too. And I think this access is needed to ensure that non-ODA recipient countries also have access to climate finance. Some of the small island developing states graduated out of ODA eligibility during COVID-19 pandemic, although their graduation was pushed back as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. But the fact that they don't have access to climate-related ODA now makes it even more crucial to ensure that climate finance goals under the UNFCCC to provide new and additional climate finance are met. I'll stop there because of time. Thank you.
Thank you, Leia. And we are indeed approaching the end of our time, but I have one question I want to ask all of you, but picking up on something that Leia said, so the need to, and you also talked about fragmentation, right? One, and then the need to coordinate perhaps at least access conditions. And that's, of course, something, it's a bit the task of the DAC, this committee at the OECD, right? To make sure that all donors work ideally with the same set of conditions in order to reduce fragmentation. Is there an additional role? So if fragmentation persists, is there an additional role that donors can play here in order to ensure that multilateral, bilateral initiatives are somehow more integrated?
Yes, thank you. I think I understood the you were a bit cut off, but I think I understood your point. I don't think the DAC is the place to ensure coordination or avoid fragmentation. I think our role is more to hold DAC members to account. They have committed to be more or less fragmented, more joined up. This is a principle that goes back to the Paris aid effectiveness declaration from 2005. So it's a very old principle, and I think it applies also to the area of climate change. And we do see that there have been some efforts also in this area, and we do have instruments to go to the partner country and be more joined up. And there's recently the Team Europe initiative is a very good example of how to be coordinated on the ground. And I think the members are still discussing how to make this evolve in the members of the European Union, but that would be one very good example. The NDC partnership is another example of how to support a partner country on their NDCs and make sure that the NDCs are developed through one instrument where all the different members can put the resources, but it's still not all the DAC members are behind the NDC partnership. I think it's 15 or 16 of them. Mm-hmm. Then we also have more and more joint programming by the multilaterals. We have the Green Climate Fund and the Green and the Global Environmental Fund that have been passed a few years ago to try and simplify access, but also work together so that there's less fragmentation. So we're getting the first results of this joint programming, and there's more work to be done, but at least this is happening. And let's see what happens now at COP, if we will get another announcement or more announcements for more joined up action. Yeah.
Great. So that's no, I was going. So you already answered in some ways my last question, or I take this as an answer. So what should come out of COP as it's in front of us in order to tackle the issues we have discussed? And both Uli and Leia raised their hand. They wanted to react, but please be short. And also, yeah, you can open a one bullet item wish list to COP28, ideally, or it can be 3, but short. Mm. So what should happen there in order to make progress on what we just discussed on climate finance issues? Uli, you raised your hand first.
Thank you. I just wanted to very quickly pick up on a couple of points that have been made. So first of all, very much in the spirit of locally led transformations, I do want to reinforce this point about also the localization of capacity building. And so I think what we're trying to do is working through universities. So build the capacities at the local universities to basically teach the local trainers. And then, so instead of having, people like me to fly in as consultants, it's very expensive. And we need to build the local capacities at the local universities to really have lasting, sustainable capacities for training officials and everyone else in the countries on the things that matter. And then the second point I wanted to make also is regarding better coordination and so on, and also better using domestic resources. Is I think there is a huge potential that can be harnessed from working with local national development banks. I think there is now a growing appreciation in general of the world of in the world of public development banks, but there is really a lot more that national development banks can do, and international development finance institutions, MDBs, can really work much more with them, also help them to build local capacities, but also very much help them to get better financing terms so that they can really mobilize much more capital, including also domestic savings, which currently are flowing out of these countries, to go back to the point I made before. Well, regarding the COP, right now I'm not overly hopeful, I must say, but hope springs eternal, so we need to be. it's not primarily in the remit of the COP. It's more kind of the Washington institutions that are in the lead here. But I think I really would hope that we make advancement regarding the debt crisis, because at the end of the day, if we want to see more capital, both public and private, flow into climate action, we will not be successful with this huge lingering debt crisis. So my wish would be, let's try to push this. And as I said before, countries like the V20 are very much calling for, linking these different crises of development and climate with solutions to the debt crisis. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. And Leia, you can also formulate a wish. And I just see that the group was so silent that I didn't expect them to comment, but now the commenting started. It's too bad that we are at the end, but I hope we have answered some of the questions. Yeah, Leia, COP28, what would you like to see there? And also feel free to comment on what you want to comment on.
For COP28, the technical discussions on the new collective quantified goal on climate finance will continue. This is the new post-2025 climate finance goal, and expected to culminate with the co-chairs outlining options on the various elements of the goal in a recommendations document. And I think it's crucial here that these options integrate considerations on the escalating debt and climate crises, on gender-responsive climate finance, as well as include a sub-goal on finance to address loss and damage in order to protect the integrity of the Paris Agreement. And then secondly, the second point I want to see from COP28 is a commitment to meet the existing global climate finance goal of 100 billion, which was extended until 2025. Countries in the global south have called for the 100 billion goal to still be met in the aggregate. They did this most recently in the Nairobi Declaration, and various other global south country groupings have made the same statement. But I think this is crucial to ensure that there is adequate climate finance to support countries and the communities. But I think it's also a measure to restore trust in the climate process and the credibility of countries in the global north to actually meet their global climate finance commitments. So I'll stop there. Those are my two things for COP28.
Everybody, so I think we delved into, well, one part of the Debating Age report, which was very important here, but we also saw that climate finance is incredibly connected. You cannot think about it in isolation. The debt crisis is important to solve, also capacity issues, and making sure that development cooperation is a lot less fragmented. So I thank you a lot, Raul, Uli, Leia, and Juan, for bringing this to our minds, for giving us these impulses to thinking, to Debating Aid, and also the audience. So we have to do this again, because next time I think we'll debate more with the audience. But anyhow, this was very important. It was inspiring. Thanks a lot, and see you soon, I hope.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
See
you.
you.
Thank you very
Bye-bye.
much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.